Grandma was shamed for wearing her husband's biker jacket. The woman behind the counter said it loud enough for the whole diner to hear. Not a whisper, not a side comment to her coworker. Loud, deliberate. The way people say things when they want an audience. She looked at the old woman in the corner booth, looked at the leather jacket she was wearing, looked at the patches on the back, and she said, "Some people just don't know when something doesn't belong to them." The diner went quiet. 78 years old, 5'1", white hair pinned up the way she'd worn it since 1974. Sitting alone in a booth with a cup of coffee and a piece of apple pie she hadn't touched yet. Wearing a black leather jacket that was 3 sizes too big for her. The sleeves rolled up twice. The back covered in patches and road pins and a bottom rocker that said Iron Valley MC. The jacket swallowed her. She wore it anyway. She'd been wearing it every single day for 8 months. She didn't look up from her coffee when the woman said it. She just set down her spoon. Very carefully, very slowly. The way you set something down when your hands are shaking and you don't want anyone to see. No one in that diner said a word. That was a Thursday morning in October. By Saturday, 200 motorcycles were parked outside that diner, engines off. Riders standing in a silence that was louder than any engine. And the woman behind the counter was standing at the window looking out at all of it, and her face had gone the color of old chalk. But to understand what that Saturday looked like, you need to go back. Not 8 months, 47 years. Because this story is not about a jacket. It has never been about a jacket. Her name is Eleanor Vance. Ellie, to everyone who knew her, which in the town of Harlan Creek, Oregon, was most people. She was born there. She went to school there. She married there in June of 1976 in the Methodist Church on Birch Street, wearing a dress her mother had made. The man she married was named Thomas Ray Vance, and he was, by every account of every person who knew him, exactly the kind of man that small towns produce once a generation and then spend decades missing after he's gone. Thomas was not what you'd expect. He didn't fit any single category. He worked at the county roads department for 32 years, maintaining the highway infrastructure of 3 counties with a dedication that his supervisor once described as almost personal. Like he took it personally when a road deteriorated. Like the roads were his and he was responsible for them. He coached Little League for 12 years even after his own kids aged out of it. He drove the church van on Sunday mornings for elderly parishioners who couldn't drive themselves. He was the first person at your door when something went wrong, and the last person to leave when the work wasn't finished. He also rode a Harley Davidson from the age of 22 until the age of 71. He'd bought his first one with 3 months of saved wages and a loan from his uncle, and ridden it to work the next day, because he said there was no point having a thing if you weren't going to use it immediately. He rode through Oregon winters in waterproof gear over his leather jacket, and he rode through Oregon summers with the windows of the world open. And he never, not once in 49 years, considered giving it up. He joined the Iron Valley MC when he was 34. This surprised some people in Harlan Creek and surprised no one who actually knew him. Because the Iron Valley MC was exactly the kind of organization Thomas Vance would join. A club that did things. Organized the county toy drive every December. Ran the Veterans Escort program that accompanied funeral processions for Harlan Creek's veterans. Did the annual charity ride that funded the county food bank. Did the work quietly, without needing acknowledgement, without a press release. Ellie had never been afraid of the bikes or the club. She'd been afraid at the beginning of the road itself, which takes people without warning and without logic and without any consideration for what they leave behind. Thomas had understood that fear. He'd never dismissed it. He'd said, "I know, I'm careful." And then he'd been careful, every day for 49 years. 2,376 weeks of being careful, of coming home. He died on a Tuesday afternoon in February, not on the road, not on the bike. In the cardiology ward of Harlan Creek General Hospital, after a heart attack that had announced itself on a Sunday evening while he was watching television, which was not dramatic and not cinematic, and was exactly the way most people go, not at the peak of something, but in the ordinary middle of a regular night. He was 71. They'd been married 47 years. The jacket was on the chair in the corner of the hospital room. He'd had it with him when the ambulance came because he'd been wearing it Sunday evening over his flannel shirt, which told you everything about Thomas Vance. That a man could wear a flannel shirt and a biker jacket on a Sunday evening in his own living room and consider himself completely normally dressed. He'd taken it off at the hospital. He never put it back on. Ellie took it home after. She didn't plan to wear it. She hung it on the hook by the back door, which was where Thomas always hung it, and she left it there. For a week, she walked past it every time she went in and out of the house. The smell of it. Old leather and road and something underneath that she couldn't name, but that was him. Specifically him, in a way that no other object in the house was. She'd given his clothes to the church donation drive. She'd cleared his nightstand. She'd done all of it with the practical purposefulness that had gotten her through 43 years of nursing on one hand, and on the other was the only way she knew how to survive something this large. She hadn't touched the jacket. 3 weeks after the funeral, on a cold Wednesday morning, she was leaving the house to go to the pharmacy, and she reached for her coat, and she stopped. She stood at the back door for a moment. Then she took the jacket off the hook and put it on. It hung off her shoulders, the sleeves covered her hands. She rolled them up twice. She zipped it to the chin. She went to the pharmacy. She didn't plan to keep doing it. But the next morning she put it on again, and the morning after. Within 2 weeks, it was simply what she wore. Not a costume, not a performance, not a statement. Just the thing she reached for in the morning because it was the last piece of him she hadn't put away, and she was not yet ready, and she didn't think she owed anyone an explanation for that. The Iron Valley MC had been to the house. Marcus Webb, the club president, had come to the funeral with all 15 active members, had ridden in the procession, had stood at the graveside in their colors and their silence. He'd come back twice in the weeks after, once with a casserole from Rose, and once just to sit at the kitchen table for an hour, because he'd known Thomas for 22 years, and sometimes sitting at a table in a place that feels wrong is better than sitting alone somewhere that feels worse. He'd seen the jacket on her. He hadn't said anything. He'd noted it the way you note something you understand. Ellie went back to her life, smaller now, quieter. She still volunteered at the clinic on Wednesday afternoons, which she'd done with Margaret Voss for years before Margaret moved back to Clover Falls. She still kept her garden. She still had Carol and the grandkids come twice a year. She walked every morning at 6 up Ridgeline Road and back, wearing Thomas's jacket over her sweater, and the few people who saw her on those early morning walks got used to the sight of it. A small, white-haired woman in an enormous black leather jacket moving at a steady pace through the morning fog. A couple of people asked about it in the first weeks. She told them. They understood. Not everyone understood. She had been going to May's Diner on Thursday mornings for 11 years. It was a thing she and Thomas had done together. Thursday breakfast before he retired and then after. Just as a habit, because you keep the habits even when the person who helped you make them is gone. She always sat in the same booth, the one by the window on the south side. She always ordered the same thing: 2 eggs scrambled, whole wheat toast, coffee with cream, and the apple pie because May's apple pie was the best in the county. And Ellie Vance was 78 years old and was not going to apologize for eating pie at 8 in the morning. She wore the jacket to May's as she wore it everywhere. She'd been doing so for 8 months. Nobody at May's had ever said anything. May herself, who was in her 60s and had known Thomas for decades, once reached over and touched the back of it briefly while refilling Ellie's coffee. Just a touch, and hadn't said anything and didn't need to. The woman behind the counter was not May. May had been in the hospital since September with her hip. The woman behind the counter was a temporary manager named Brenda, brought in from the regional food service company that co-owned the franchise. She was in her late 40s. She had been in Harlan Creek for 6 weeks. She knew no one's history and had asked after none of it. She'd made the comment once before, the previous week, not that loud, but loud enough. Ellie had heard it. She'd chosen not to respond, which was what she did with things that didn't warrant engagement. She'd finished her breakfast and left a tip and walked home. The second time was louder. Some people just don't know when something doesn't belong to them. The diner went quiet the way diners go quiet, which is total and immediate. Everyone suddenly very interested in their plates. Ellie set down her spoon. She did not look up. 2 tables over, a man named Gerald Hutchins, who had known Thomas Vance since high school, half rose from his seat and then sat back down. The particular indecision of a person who wants to do something and doesn't know what the right thing is. Ellie picked up her coffee cup. She drank. She set it down. She looked out the window at the street, which was Harlan Creek's Main Street on a Thursday morning, which looked the way it always looked. She put her hand flat on the table. Then she got up, put on her coat, the jacket which she'd taken off to sit down, she folded over her arm, and she walked to the counter. She paid for her coffee and her pie. She left the exact tip she always left. She said nothing to Brenda. She walked out the front door and down the steps, and she walked home on the same route she always walked. She thought she was fine until she got to her back door and reached for the hook to hang up the jacket, and her hands were shaking too badly to manage the clasp, and she stood there in her kitchen for a while before she sat down at the table. She was not sad exactly. She was something that didn't have a clean name. Something that happened when a wound you thought was scarring got opened again in a way you hadn't expected, in a way that wasn't even dramatic. Just a woman's voice in a diner saying something careless and cruel in front of 12 people who said nothing. She called Marcus Webb that evening. She hadn't planned to. She was calling to ask about the toy drive timeline because she helped coordinate the donations every year, and it was October, and they needed to start. She'd meant to ask about the toy drive, and instead she told him what happened, which she hadn't planned to do. And once she started, she told him all of it, including the first time the week before, and including the part about her hands shaking at the back door, which she told him without fully meaning to, and then couldn't take back. Marcus listened. He asked 2 questions. He said, "I'll call you tomorrow, Ellie." She said, "Marcus, don't do anything." He said, "I know." She said it again because she meant it. He said, "I hear you." He called Rose after he hung up. Rose called Cartwright, and then the phone calls went the way phone calls in this network went when they needed to, which was outward and fast and with very few words required, because the people in this network had been doing this long enough to understand each other without requiring a full briefing. Thorne, the oldest member, heard the story from Diesel in 4 sentences and said nothing for a moment and then said, "Saturday." Diesel said, "Yeah." That was the whole conversation. By Friday evening, Marcus had 43 confirmed. By Friday night, he had 112. By Saturday morning, 2 hours before the agreed time, his phone had not stopped. A chapter from Portland that had heard through a mutual connection. 2 riders from a club in Grants Pass that wasn't affiliated, but whose president had known Thomas Vance from the Veterans Ride Circuit for 15 years. Individual riders, not club members. People who'd ridden with Thomas once or twice or a dozen times. People who'd been at his funeral. People who'd heard from someone who'd heard from someone. He called Ellie at 7 on Saturday morning. He said, "Ellie, I need to tell you something before you leave the house." She said, "Marcus." He said, "I know what you said. I want you to know I didn't plan this." She said, "What did you plan?" He said, "Not 200 people." She was quiet for a moment. He said, "We'd like to take you to breakfast at May's." She said, "It's a Thursday tradition." He said, "It's Saturday, but I think we can make an exception." Another pause. She said, "How many?" He said, "Somewhere around 200, last count. More might show up." She said, "Marcus Webb, I told you not to do anything." He said, "You told me not to do anything bad." She thought about this. She said, "That is not what I said." He said, "Can you be ready in an hour?" Right now, before you hear what happened at May's Diner on that Saturday morning, I want to stop and ask where you're watching this from. Put your city in the comments. Because this story has been traveling in ways I didn't expect, and I want to know where it's landing. And I'll tell you something at the end of this that I've been holding back. Something about what happened 6 weeks after Saturday that nobody outside Harlan Creek has heard yet. Your city, and stay with me. She was ready in 45 minutes. She wore the jacket. She wore it the way she always wore it, sleeves rolled up twice, zipped to the chin. She stood on her front porch waiting, and she heard them before she saw them, which was how it always was, the sound preceding the sight by a full 30 seconds, the particular low rolling thunder of many engines that was nothing like weather and nothing like any other sound in the world. They came down Ridgeline Road 2 by 2. They turned on the Maple and came down to her street, and they kept coming. She stood on her porch and she watched them come, and she put her hand on the porch railing because the moment required something to hold on to. 207 motorcycles, not all of them Harleys. Most. Enough. Chrome in the October morning light, leather vests with patches, men and women she knew and men and women she'd never seen in her life. All of them there, all of them coming down her street, all of them slowing as they reached her house. Marcus pulled up first. He got off his bike. He walked up to her porch. He was a large man, Marcus, had always been, and he was standing at the bottom of her steps looking up at her, and he had the expression he sometimes had in church, which was not an expression you expected on a face like his, and was all the more real for the surprise of it. "Morning, Ellie," he said. "Good morning, Marcus," she said. He looked at the jacket. "That's his," he said. He said it like a statement of fact that carried more than the fact itself. "It is," she said. He looked at it for another moment, then he held out his arm. She took it. They walked down the porch steps together, Ellie Vance, 78 years old, in her late husband's Iron Valley MC jacket, and 200 riders parted to let them through to the front. And then the engine started up again, one by one, and then all at once, and they rode to May's Diner in a procession down the main street of Harlan Creek on a Saturday morning that nobody who saw it from their window, or their car, or their own front porch ever forgot. May's Diner had 12 tables and a counter with 8 stools. 207 people was not logistically a May's Diner situation. What happened instead was this: the bikes parked on every available surface of the surrounding block. The riders stood outside on the sidewalk and in the parking lot in the October morning chill, not going anywhere, not doing anything, just standing. Ellie went inside with Marcus and Thorne and Rose and 2 others. She went to her regular booth, the one by the window on the south side. She sat down. Brenda was behind the counter. Brenda had arrived at 7:30 for her opening shift and had looked out the window at 6:30 in the morning's worth of motorcycles filling the block and had not, in 6 weeks of being the temporary manager of May's Diner, experienced anything she could use as a reference point for what she was looking at. She had considered calling the police. She had not called the police because none of the riders were doing anything except standing. She was standing behind the counter when Ellie came in, and her face was the face of someone trying very hard to look like they knew what was happening. Ellie sat down. She looked out the window at the people standing in the parking lot. Then she looked at Brenda. She said, "Coffee with cream, please, and the apple pie." Brenda got the coffee. Nobody said anything dramatic. There was no confrontation. There was no speech. Marcus and Thorne and Rose and the others sat in the booth and at the adjacent table, and they had breakfast. Outside, 200 riders stood in the cold and waited. Some of them talked quietly. Some of them didn't. A few people from Harlan Creek who'd been passing by stopped and stayed when they understood what they were looking at. Gerald Hutchins, who'd been in the diner on Thursday and had half stood from his chair and sat back down, arrived on foot at 8:15 with his wife and stood in the parking lot with his arms crossed, not going anywhere. The morning light was doing that thing it does in Oregon in October, when the air is clean and cold and everything looks recently washed. The chrome on the bikes caught it. 200 people in leather and denim stood outside a diner in a small town, holding coffee from a gas station down the block, and not going anywhere, and not asking for anything, just present, just there, just, we know what this jacket is, and we know who wore it first, And we know who wears it now, and we are here to say so. Ellie ate her pie. She drank her coffee. She did not cry in the diner, which she had decided before she walked in. She looked out the window at all of them, at this enormous, improbable gathering of people who had come from 3 states for a Thursday morning tradition on a Saturday. And she felt something move through her that she didn't have a name for and didn't need one. When she was done, she left her usual tip. She stood up and put the jacket back on, the sleeves rolled up, zipped to the chin. She walked to the door. She pushed it open. 200 people turned to look at her. And then something happened that nobody had organized, nobody had planned, nobody had signaled. The riders, all of them, removed their hats. Not in a military way, not in a performed way, just every hat came off, every head bowed slightly. Every person standing in that parking lot and on that sidewalk acknowledging, in the only way available to a large group of people who don't have the words for it, the 78-year-old woman in the doorway of May's diner in the leather jacket that was 3 sizes too big for her. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she said, quietly enough that only the first few rows heard it, and then it traveled back person by person like a whisper. He would have loved this. There was a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a cheer, something between the two that didn't have a word for it, but that everyone who was there would describe the same way years later. Like something releasing. Like the particular sound a room makes when something that was held too tight is finally allowed to breathe. They rode back together, Ellie in the middle of the procession this time, not the front, which was where she wanted to be, surrounded, enclosed, carried along. She didn't have a bike. She rode with Marcus in the sidecar of the old rig he kept for exactly these occasions. The one Thomas had ridden in twice on the veterans' escort runs when the route was long and the weather was bad. She fit perfectly. She always had. Now here is the thing that happened 6 weeks later. The thing I told you I was holding back. The thing that, when I heard it, made me understand that this story is not actually about a jacket, and it never was. May came back from her hip surgery in late November. She came back to her diner on the first Monday of December, which was 11 weeks after the surgery and 6 weeks after the Saturday, and she came back to find 2 things that had not been there when she left. The first was a framed photograph on the wall behind the counter. An 8x10 black and white, taken from somewhere across the street by someone with a good eye and a good lens, showing the exterior of her diner on a Saturday morning in October. The bikes filling the block, the riders standing in their rows, and through the glass of the diner window, barely visible but unmistakable to anyone who knew them, a small white-haired woman in a large leather jacket sitting alone in the corner booth. The photo had a small brass plate on the frame. The plate read, October 14th, for Thomas. The second thing was an envelope taped to the inside of the cash register. May opened it on her first morning back. Inside was a handwritten note from Marcus Webb and a bank transfer receipt. The note was 4 sentences. It said, May, we're sorry we couldn't be here while you were gone. We're glad you're back. The enclosed is toward the renovation you've been putting off since 2019. From the Iron Valley, with Thomas's compliments. The amount was enough to redo the kitchen. May stood behind her counter on her first morning back and read the note twice and looked at the photograph on the wall and looked out the window at Main Street, which was just Main Street, and she picked up the phone and called Ellie. Ellie answered on the second ring. May said, I'm back. Ellie said, I know. How's the hip? May said, better. Ellie, the photograph. Ellie said, Marcus's idea. The photographer was Gerald Hutchins' son. He had a good camera. May said, the kitchen. Ellie said, Thomas always said you made the best pie in the county, and you were working in a kitchen from 1987. He'd been saying we should do something about it for 3 years. We just needed the right occasion. There was a silence. May said, Ellie. Ellie said, don't make it bigger than it is. May said, it's already as big as it is. There's no making it bigger. Another silence, the kind that doesn't need filling. May said, Thursday? Ellie said. Thursday, same booth. I want to tell you something about grief, because this story is about grief as much as it's about anything else, and I think the way it handles grief is worth sitting with for a moment. We have a specific and deeply unhelpful set of ideas about what grief is supposed to look like. It is supposed to be private. It is supposed to diminish over time in a linear, trackable way. It is supposed to be managed, and when it is not being managed, it is supposed to be kept at home. We regard public grief with a certain discomfort, especially grief that is worn on the body, grief that announces itself, grief that hasn't been put away. A person who visibly carries their loss invites a particular kind of social unease that often manifests, as it did in May's diner on a Thursday morning in October, as cruelty. Ellie Vance was wearing her grief. She knew she was. She had thought about it. She had made a decision that she did not owe anyone an explanation for the thing that was keeping her alive on the difficult mornings. The thing she reached for at the back door. The thing that smelled like him in a way that the whole house was slowly losing. The thing that said, I was loved. I loved. It was real. It was worth something. It is worth something still. She was right. She did not owe anyone an explanation. She also did not need 200 people to come to a diner on a Saturday morning to vindicate her. She would have been right regardless. She would have kept wearing the jacket regardless. She is the kind of woman who is not moved off the things she knows to be true by a comment from a stranger who doesn't know what they're looking at. But 200 people came anyway. Not because she needed them to, because they needed to. Because there is something that happens in a community, in a family, in a club, in any group of people who have loved the same person, when that person is gone and someone treats what they left behind carelessly. It is not anger, exactly, though there is anger in it. It is something more like, no, this is what he was. This is who she is. This is what 47 years looks like when it doesn't fit in a frame or a ceremony or a casserole. When it's a leather jacket on a woman's shoulders at 8 in the morning in the corner booth of a small-town diner. You don't get to look at that and see something that doesn't belong. Thomas Ray Vance belonged to Ellie Vance. She belonged to him. The jacket belonged to both of them. 200 people came to say so on a Saturday morning. 200 people stood in the cold and removed their hats. One woman ate her pie. One photograph went on the wall behind the counter. One kitchen got renovated. Thomas's compliments. And every Thursday morning, in the booth by the south window, a 78-year-old woman in an oversized black leather jacket drinks coffee with cream and eats the best apple pie in the county. And nobody says a word except May, who comes over to refill the cup and sometimes touches the back of the jacket as she passes, just briefly, the same way she always has. A touch that says, I know what this is. I know who wore it first. I know who wears it now. Some things are exactly where they belong. Now I want to ask you something before you go. Not about grief, not about jackets, about the moment in this story that I think most people walk past because it's quiet. It's the moment on Thursday morning when 12 people in a diner heard something cruel said to a 78-year-old woman and went very still. When Gerald Hutchins half stood from his chair and sat back down. When everyone looked at their plates. I have been there. In those moments. Most of us have. The moment when something wrong happens in front of you and you feel the impulse to respond and you sit with it for a half second too long. And then the moment passes and you carry it afterward. The particular weight of having had the chance to do the right thing and chosen the easier one. Gerald Hutchins showed up on Saturday morning with his wife and stood in the parking lot for 2 hours in the October cold. He didn't say that out loud to anyone. He didn't explain it, but he was there. That's the thing about these moments. They don't have to end on Thursday. Sometimes you get a Saturday. If you've been watching this with a Thursday on your conscience, I want you to know the Saturday is available. The chance to show up, to stand in the cold, to take your hat off, to let someone know they are not alone in the thing they are carrying. It doesn't have to be 200 people. It can be one. It can be you, alone, going back to the thing you didn't do and doing it now. It's not too late. It is almost never too late. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me about a jacket you're carrying. Tell me about a Gerald Hutchins moment and what you did with it after. Tell me who the Thomas is in your life, the person whose absence has a shape that you're still learning to move around. And if you're not done with stories like this one, there are others on this channel that will stay with you the same way this one will. There's the story of the retired nurse who sat up all night to keep a stranger breathing, and 200 Harleys showed up the next morning. There's the story of the librarian who found a letter in a book that had been waiting 14 years. There's the story of the soldier's last promise and 600 miles of Oregon highway. Every one of them is about the same question this story asks. What do you do when someone needs you to show up? And every one of them will answer it in a way you're not expecting. They're waiting for you. But first, is there someone in your life right now carrying something too heavy in a coat that doesn't fit? Someone whose grief you've been watching from a distance, waiting for the right moment to say something, waiting until you know what the right thing to say is. You already know what the right thing is. Show up. Stand in the cold. Take your hat off. That's the whole thing. That's always been the whole thing. The jacket is still on her shoulders. Every Thursday, booth by the south window, apple pie at 8 in the morning. She's doing just fine. There is one more thing I haven't told you about Ellie Vance, and I want to tell it now because it is the detail that makes everything else make sense. 3 weeks after the Saturday, on a Wednesday afternoon, she was at the county clinic for her usual volunteer shift, helping with intake and patient management the way she'd been doing for 6 years since she retired from nursing full-time. A young woman came in, mid-20s. She was sitting in the waiting area in a way that said the waiting area was not where the real problem was. The real problem was somewhere else, and she had come to the clinic because she didn't know where else to go. Ellie noticed. She sat down next to her. They talked for 30 minutes. The young woman's name was Jessie. She'd lost her father 4 months earlier. Not to illness. To an accident, quick, with no chance to say the things you mean to say. She'd been managing it, she said. She'd been fine. And then 6 weeks ago, she'd just stopped being fine, and she didn't know how to start again. She was not in crisis. She just couldn't find the floor. She'd come to the clinic because she'd come to the clinic, and she didn't know what she was expecting. Ellie listened. She asked questions. She did not offer solutions or timelines or the particular toxic positivity of people who want the grief to resolve faster than it wants to resolve. At the end of the 30 minutes, she said, "Are you busy Thursday morning?" Jessie said, "No." Ellie said, "There's a diner on Main Street, May's. The apple pie is the best in the county. Come at 8, and I'll be in the booth by the south window. You can tell me about your father, and I'll tell you about Thomas, and we don't have to have any conclusions about any of it." Jessie came on Thursday. She came the Thursday after that. She has come most Thursdays since. She doesn't always talk about her father. Sometimes she talks about other things. Sometimes they eat pie in a comfortable silence that is the best kind of silence, the kind that two people who've decided to stop performing fine can sit in without it meaning anything except, "I'm here, and so are you." And that's enough. Ellie Vance opened a door, the same door she's always opened, the one she opens every morning when she reaches for the jacket at the back door and puts it on and goes out into the world, wearing her grief where everyone can see it, daring anyone to say it doesn't belong to her. It belongs to her. She belongs to it. That is what love looks like 47 years in, and 8 months after, and every Thursday morning going forward, for as long as she wants to sit in that booth. The jacket fits her perfectly. It always did. Let me go back to the morning Thomas died, because you need to understand what that morning was in order to understand everything that came after. It was a Tuesday, February. The kind of February morning in Harlan Creek that doesn't have drama in it, just gray and cold and the sound of the furnace cycling on. The kind of morning that exists only to be the background of other things. Ellie had been at the hospital since Sunday night, in the chair beside his bed that had a fold-out cushion she'd learned to make tolerable by stacking a folded blanket under herself on the first night, The way you learn hospital chairs when you've worked in hospitals for 30 years and know that comfort is a decision you have to make actively. She'd slept in that chair 2 nights. She'd held his hand on the 3rd night when the monitors started saying the things monitors say. He'd been conscious until about 3 in the morning, not lucid exactly, but present. She'd talked to him. She'd told him about the garden, which was not ready for spring yet, but which would be, which she was planning to put the sweet peas in on the south wall this year because they'd done better there in 2019 than anywhere else. She told him Carol had called. She told him Gerald and Pat sent their love. She told him what she'd eaten for dinner from the hospital cafeteria, which was a thing she'd been telling him every evening for 47 years because he always asked, because he was interested, because he was the kind of man who wanted to know what you'd eaten as a way of knowing how your day was. She told him about the weather outside, which was the gray February weather she'd described to him already twice, but which felt like the right thing to keep saying. Like keeping him updated on the ordinary world was a way of keeping him anchored in it. He died at 7:42 in the morning. The monitors did what they did. The nurses came, who were people she knew, some of them students she'd mentored a decade earlier, and she let them do the things they did, and she stood back the way she'd learned to stand back in those rooms, the professional distance that coexists with the personal closeness without canceling it out. She had done this job. She knew what it looked like from this side. What she hadn't known, and what you don't know until you're in it, is what it feels like to watch someone do their job on the person who was the center of everything you've been doing your job to come home to. That's the part that isn't in any of the training. She called Carol. She called Marcus. She called Thomas's sister Ruth in Medford. She made the calls that needed to be made with the efficiency she brought to everything, clear and accurate and without falling apart. Because falling apart was something she could do later, and there were things that needed doing now. She was the same woman she had been for 43 years of nursing, the one who stayed upright when the room required it. She took the jacket off the chair and folded it over her arm and went home. The house was the particular silence of a house that has been adjusted to 2 people for 47 years and has not yet been told it is now a house for 1. Everything was where he had put it, because he was a man who put things in specific places and left them there, who maintained a personal geography of the rooms that she had lived inside so long it had become her own. His reading glasses on the end table, his slippers under the couch, his half-finished crossword on the coffee table with the pen clipped to the page, the kind of pause you make when you're going to come back to it. She didn't move any of it for 2 weeks. And here is the thing about Ellie Vance that nobody who only saw the Thursday morning diner story would know. She was not a woman who unraveled. She was a woman who absorbed. She had spent 43 years holding things for other people, standing in the room with the full weight of other people's worst moments, and she had done it with the steadiness of someone who has developed, through practice and through something that is not quite training, the capacity to hold a great deal without it showing on the outside. This was her gift, and it was her cost. She held things cleanly, neatly, without making it anyone else's problem. She held this the same way. She gave away his clothes, which was practical and necessary, and also took her 4 hours one Saturday because she kept stopping and holding things and then putting them in the bag anyway because that was what she had decided to do. She cleared his nightstand, which had his reading glasses case and his blood pressure medication, and a small notebook he kept by the bed for notes he'd write and then forget he'd written, which she flipped through before she put it away and found, in the middle of a list of hardware store items he'd needed in September, a sentence that said, Ellie. The sweet peas on the south wall. She makes everything grow. She closed the notebook. She put it in the box she was keeping. She did all of this, and the jacket stayed on the hook. She tells it this way. She didn't decide to keep it there. She just noticed, on the 3rd day, that her hand kept going to her coat and bypassing the jacket. The deliberate bypass of something you're not ready to touch. And on the 4th day, her hand went to the jacket instead, and she stood there for a moment, and then she hung her coat back up and put the jacket on and went out. The smell of it was the thing. She says this plainly, without embarrassment. The smell. Old leather and road, and something that was specifically him, that she couldn't describe more precisely than that, because smell doesn't translate, because it lives in a part of the brain that doesn't connect to language, that connects instead to the body's oldest memory. She put on the jacket and she went to the pharmacy and she came home. And on the way home she passed 4 people who said nothing and one person, Mrs. Agnes Kemp from the post office, who looked at the jacket and looked at Ellie's face and said, "Good morning, Ellie," and kept walking, which was exactly right, which was the correct response, which Agnes had calibrated instinctively because Agnes had been doing the right thing instinctively for 60 years. She kept wearing it. She wore it to the clinic. She wore it to the garden center in March. She wore it to the Easter service in April, which raised exactly one eyebrow from a woman named Helen, who raised an eyebrow at a lot of things, and whose opinion had never been a useful guide to anything. She wore it to Carol's in May, and Carol, who was her daughter and who had her mother's directness, if not always her mother's economy of words, looked at the jacket and said, "Does it help?" Ellie said, "Yes." Carol said, "Then wear it." That was the whole conversation. She wore it to May's every Thursday. May knew. May had known Thomas since they were both in their 40s, had served him his Thursday eggs for 11 years, knew exactly what the jacket was and what it meant, and why it was on Ellie's shoulders and not in a box in the attic. May had the quality of long-established proprietors of long-established places. She knew the history of her regulars the way the walls of the diner knew it, absorbed over years, structural, load-bearing. She understood the jacket without being told anything, which is why when a temporary manager who had been in Harlan Creek for 6 weeks said, in May's diner, in front of May's regulars, loud enough for the room to hear, "Some people just don't know when something doesn't belong to them," she was not only saying it to Ellie, she was saying it in a room that knew better. In a room that had been watching Ellie Vance wear that jacket for 8 months. In a room full of people who knew exactly who Thomas Ray Vance was and what 47 years of marriage looked like from the outside when you'd been watching it for a decade over Thursday eggs. And the room said nothing. That is the part of this story that I can't leave alone. Not the cruelty, which was ignorant and small and the kind of thing that stupid remarks always are, specific in their damage and generic in their character. But the silence. The room full of people who knew and said nothing. Gerald Hutchins, who had known Thomas since they were 17 years old, who had stood at his graveside 6 months earlier, who half rose from his chair and sat back down. Why do we do that? I know why. I've done it. You've done it. The moment arrives before you're ready for it, and you run the calculation so fast you barely know you're running it, and the calculation says, what if I say something and I'm wrong? What if I make it worse? What if she doesn't want me to intervene? What if it creates a scene? What if I embarrass her more than she's already embarrassed? All of those calculations are real. Some of them are even reasonable, and by the time you've run them, the moment is past. Gerald Hutchins sat down. He didn't sleep well Thursday night. He told his wife what had happened, which he hadn't meant to do, but the thing was in him and needed to come out. And Pat listened to the whole thing and said, "Thomas would have said something." Gerald said, "I know." Pat said, "You can still say something." Gerald said, "It's been 2 days." Pat said, "So?" He called Marcus on Friday afternoon. Marcus already knew. Marcus said, "Saturday." Gerald said, "I'll be there." He was there at 7:30. He stood in the parking lot for 2.5 hours. He did not think it was enough. He was right that it wasn't enough, in the pure accounting sense of Thursday required something and Saturday was a different day. But Saturday was what was available, and he took it, and that matters. And you should know it matters, because the alternative to taking the Saturday is to carry the Thursday forever. He told Ellie about it 2 weeks later, over coffee at her kitchen table. He told her he'd been there on Thursday and hadn't said anything, and he was sorry. She listened to all of it. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Gerald, you came on Saturday." He said, "That's not the same as Thursday." She said, "No, but it's not nothing." He said, "I should have said something." She said, "Yes, you should have." He looked at his coffee. She said, "And now you will, the next time." That's how Ellie Vance handles things, directly, without softening it, but also without cruelty, because she spent 43 years knowing that cruelty doesn't help and accuracy does. He will, the next time. And there will be a next time, for Gerald and for all of us, because the world does not stop producing moments that require something from us and then letting us off the hook when we miss them. It produces the next one and the one after, and it keeps producing them until we become the kind of person who responds instead of the kind who calculates. Now let me tell you about the photograph, because the photograph is the thing that stays with me, and I think it will stay with you too. Gerald Hutchins's son is named Nathan. He's 29. He works for a regional newspaper that covers 4 counties and takes photographs that are, by the general assessment of anyone who looks at them, significantly better than what a regional 4-county newspaper typically produces. He had heard about Saturday from his father, who had called him at 6 in the morning to say something was happening, and he should come with his camera, which was how Gerald Hutchins processed his Friday night guilt, by finding the useful, practical action he could still take. Nathan came. He stood on the opposite side of the street with a long lens and a steady hand and the particular eye of someone who understands that the real moment is never the obvious one. He photographed the bikes. He photographed the riders. He photographed Marcus walking up Ellie's porch steps and Ellie taking his arm. He photographed the procession down Main Street, which was, as a photograph, already extraordinary. But the photograph that went on the wall behind May's counter was taken at 8:47 in the morning, through the glass of the diner window from across the street. Through the window you could see the interior of May's in the morning light. The red vinyl booths, the chrome counter stools, the framed photographs on the walls. And in the corner booth, the south-facing one, small and solitary and completely at ease, a white-haired woman in a leather jacket sat with her hands around a coffee cup looking out the window. Her face was in 3/4 profile. The light was the particular October morning light that doesn't forgive or flatter, just illuminates, and in that light she looked like exactly what she was, a woman who was there, who was present, who had not been moved. Outside, through the same glass, reflected in a way that Nathan had not planned and that the light had done on its own, you could see the ghost reflection of the bikes and the riders standing in the parking lot, overlaid on the window behind her. So the photograph held both things at once, the woman inside alone in her booth, and the 200 people outside standing for her, and the glass between them, which was not a separation, but a membrane, thin and clear. Marcus had it printed and framed and brought it to May the week before she came back from surgery. He didn't tell May. He just gave it to Rose and asked her to put it on the wall. Rose put it in the right place, which was behind the counter, where May could see it from wherever she was standing, which meant it was the first thing May saw when she came back on her first Monday morning. May stood behind the counter for a long time looking at the photograph. Then she looked at the envelope taped inside the cash register. Then she looked at the photograph again. She called to Ellie. "The conversation I told you about." May said, "Thursday?" Ellie said, "Thursday, same booth." It has been 23 Thursdays since then. The photograph is still on the wall. The kitchen is being renovated starting in January, a full rebuild, commercial range and updated ventilation and new tile that May chose herself in a trip to Portland with her niece in December. The contractor is a man from the Iron Valley MC's extended network who is doing the work at cost because that is what you do when the project is May's kitchen in Harlan Creek, and the reason for the kitchen is Thomas Vance's compliments. The pie will continue. Let's be clear about this. The pie will continue throughout the renovation because May is serving it from a fold-out table in the dining room if she has to, and nobody is going to tell her otherwise. Every Thursday morning at 8, in the booth by the south window, Ellie Vance orders 2 eggs scrambled, whole wheat toast, coffee with cream, and the apple pie. She wears the jacket. Jesse comes some Thursdays and they sit together. Gerald and Pat have joined them twice, which started as awkward and became simply pleasant, which is how most awkward things end if you give them time. Marcus comes on the first Thursday of every month, which he decided without announcing it, and which Ellie accepted without comment, but with the look she has that means, "You are a good man, and I will not embarrass you by saying so." The jacket is on her shoulders. It is exactly where it belongs. And so, Before you close this and go on with your day, I want you to think about the thing you're carrying. Not the grief necessarily, though maybe that. The thing that you've been wearing in a way that invites other people's commentary. The decision you've made about how to live through something that other people keep suggesting you should put away by now, that you should handle differently, that doesn't look quite right from the outside. You don't owe them an explanation. You know what you're carrying. You know why. You know what it smells like and what it cost, and what it keeps you connected to on the mornings when the connection is the only thing keeping you from going under. That knowledge is yours. It is not subject to revision by people who haven't earned the right to have an opinion about it. Wear it. Keep wearing it. And on the Thursdays when someone looks at you and says something careless about what they don't understand, I want you to know, there is a parking lot full of people who would stand in the cold for you if they knew. Some of them you know. Some of them you haven't met yet. Some of them are going to appear in your life from a direction you didn't expect, the way a phone call goes out and comes back as 200 engines. They are out there, and you are not carrying this alone. Even when it feels like you are, even in the booth by the south window with your coffee and your pie and the jacket on your shoulders, looking out at the street, you are not alone. Thomas knew that. It's why he wore it for 49 years. It's why she wears it now. Some things are exactly where they belong. Here is what the Iron Valley MC is, and what it isn't, because people hear the words biker club and construct a picture that has nothing to do with what I'm describing. It is not a large organization. 15 active members in the Harlan Creek chapter. Average age somewhere around 54, which tells you something. These are not young men performing something. These are people in the middle of their lives, with jobs and families and histories, who happen to ride, who happen to have found in each other a particular kind of trust that is harder to find than it looks from the outside. The kind of trust that comes from years of riding together, which means years of being responsible for each other's safety on the road, which creates a bond that is physical and practical before it is anything more abstract. Thomas had been a member for 37 years. He joined when he was 34, which was the year Marcus joined, which was how they'd met, which was the origin of a friendship that had lasted 22 years and that Marcus describes, when asked, as one of the more useful things that had happened to him, which is how Marcus describes everything that matters to him, as useful. He has a quality of understatement that Thomas shared, the quality of men who know the value of things and don't need to inflate it with language. He'd been club president for 7 years. Before that, VP for 4. Before that, road captain for 6, which was the role that suited him best because it required exactly the skills he was best at. Logistics, attention to the physical world, the ability to hold a large number of variables in his head simultaneously and produce the right outcome. He was good at outcomes. He was the person you called when something needed to happen, and needed to happen correctly. He called the right people. The response surprised even him, not because he didn't understand the love for Thomas, which he did, which he shared, which was the thing that had woken him up on Thursday night after Ellie's call and kept him awake, but because the thing that went out through the network traveled farther than he'd expected and came back from directions he hadn't anticipated. And what came back with it was not just numbers, but stories. People calling to say, I rode with Thomas on the Veterans Escort 3 years ago, and I want to be there. People calling to say, I don't know Ellie Vance, but I know what that jacket means, and I want to be there. People who'd heard from someone who'd heard from someone. The particular transmission of a story that has the quality of being real, that moves because it's true and people recognize it as true, and truth pulls people in directions they didn't plan to go. 207 people. Marcus stood on Ellie's street on Saturday morning and looked at all of them and felt something he describes as complicated. Complicated because it was more than he'd asked for and more than Thomas had ever asked for himself, and Thomas would have been embarrassed by it. Which was the point, which was the whole point, which was that Thomas would have been embarrassed by 200 people showing up for him, and so the 200 people were showing up for Ellie instead, who was carrying him, and would therefore carry all of it for him now. That's the logic. That's the whole logic. It's not complicated. It's just love, applied sideways, in the direction available. The procession down Main Street lasted 11 minutes. Nathan Hutchins photographed it from the hardware store roof, having gotten up there with his father's help at 7:15 and positioned himself at the end of the block. He got the full length of it in a single shot. Bikes as far back as the frame could hold, chrome and leather in the October light, and at the front, small enough in the frame that you had to look to find her, but unmistakable once you did. A white-haired woman in a leather jacket, riding in Marcus Webb's sidecar. Her hand was on the edge of the sidecar. Her face was turned slightly into the wind. She looked, Nathan said later, like a person who knew exactly where she was going. She did. She was going to breakfast. The 2 hours outside May's Diner were two of the quietest hours Harlan Creek had collectively experienced in recent memory, which was noted by several people who were there and who observed, some of them for the first time, what 200 people look like when they have decided to be still. Not passive, not inactive, still. The difference is intention. They were still on purpose. They were choosing, each of them, to let the stillness do the work, to let the fact of their presence be the entire statement. Some of them had met Thomas, some hadn't. Some had heard his name for the first time that week. It didn't matter. The story had been enough. The story was enough because the story was true, and the story was simple. A woman was wearing her husband's jacket. She'd worn it every day for 8 months. Someone had publicly humiliated her for it. That was the whole story. It didn't require elaboration. It didn't require context. It was complete and self-evident, and 200 people in Southern Oregon understood it immediately and completely, and showed up on a Saturday morning to stand in the cold and say, "We see you, and we know what that jacket is, and you have not been abandoned in what you're carrying." Brenda resigned the following Monday. She said later that it was a mutual decision with the regional management company. Whether that is precisely accurate is not something I can verify. What I can tell you is that by Monday morning, the photograph Nathan Hutchins had posted on a local Facebook group had been shared 14,000 times, which in a county with a population of 40,000 is a number that makes the phrase mutual decision easy to understand. May came back in late November. She came back to her diner and her photograph and her envelope, and she stood behind her counter on the first morning and she looked at all of it and she said, quietly, to no one in particular, "Thomas, you old softy." And then she opened for business. That's it. That's the whole story. Or rather, that's where the story you can tell in a single sitting ends, because the actual story has no end. Because the actual story is still going. Is Thursday morning in the booth by the south window? Is Jesse coming through the door at 8:05? Is Gerald and Pat sitting across from Ellie and learning, slowly, how to be present with someone's grief instead of careful around it? Is Marcus on the first Thursday of every month? Is May refilling the coffee and touching the back of the jacket as she passes? The actual story is a woman who is 78 years old and who gets up every morning and reaches for the hook by the back door and puts on a jacket that is 3 sizes too big for her and goes out into the world wearing it. And what she is saying when she does, what she has been saying for 8 months without a word, is this: I loved someone for 47 years. He is gone. The love is not. It does not go when the person goes. It stays. It has weight and smell and a shape, and it fits me exactly, and I am going to wear it, and you are going to have to find a way to be all right with that, because I have made my peace with it, and my peace does not require your approval. That is an extraordinary thing to know about yourself at 78, or at any age. The knowledge that your grief belongs to you and not to the comfort of the people watching you grieve. Most of us don't arrive at that knowledge easily. Most of us are too busy managing how our losses look to other people to actually live inside them, which is where the living is. Ellie Vance lives inside it. She wears it. She carries it down Ridgeline Road at 6 in the morning in the frost, and she carries it to the clinic on Wednesdays, and she carries it to May's on Thursdays, and she carries it through the rest of the week, which is the rest of her life, which she is living fully and without apology. 200 people stood in the cold to honor that. One photograph is on a wall. One kitchen is being renovated. One jacket is on one pair of shoulders. Every single Thursday. If there is someone in your life right now who is carrying something that shows, who is wearing their loss in a way that makes other people uncomfortable, who hasn't put it away yet because they're not ready and they know what they need, and what they need is to not put it away yet, I want you to be the person who doesn't say anything about the jacket, who pours the coffee, who touches the back of it as you pass by. That's the whole job. That's Gerald's job, and May's job, and Marcus's job. And it is, if you will let it be, yours. The booth by the south window is full. Come in out of the cold. There's pie. I want to take you back to one moment in this story that I haven't given enough time to. The moment on Thursday morning when Ellie got up and walked to the counter and paid her bill. She had options. She could have said something to Brenda. She was not, by any measure, someone who lacked the ability to say something. She had spent 43 years in emergency medicine, which means she had spent 43 years telling people things they didn't want to hear, in the plainest possible language, because there was not time for the diplomatic version, and because the plain version was more useful. She had told families their person was not coming home. She had told patients that the thing they hoped wasn't serious was very serious. She had done this 10,000 times with the combination of kindness and precision that is the hardest combination to hold simultaneously, and she had learned to hold it because the alternative was to fail people at the moments that mattered most. She could have said something to Brenda. She didn't. Not because she was afraid, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had looked at Brenda across the counter and understood, with the diagnostic speed of 3 decades in emergency rooms, that Brenda was not a person who was going to hear the thing that needed to be said from Ellie Vance in that moment. Brenda was someone who had said what she said because she felt secure in saying it, because the room had not stopped her the first time, because she'd been operating for 6 weeks in a context she didn't understand and had arrived at the wrong conclusions about what was acceptable. Nothing Ellie said in that moment, in that diner, was going to produce a useful result. Ellie had learned this principle early. You don't spend your limited energy on interventions that are going to fail. You identify the place where the intervention will land. She paid her bill. She left her tip. She walked out. And then she called Marcus. That was the intervention. Marcus is what happens when Ellie's assessment lands in the right place. 200 people is what happens when Marcus makes the calls. And Saturday morning is what happens when Harlan Creek, which had been silent on Thursday, finally found its voice. Not in words, in presence. In chrome and leather and engine sound, and 200 people standing in the cold with their hats in their hands. The diner understood on Saturday morning what it had failed to do on Thursday morning. The town understood. Gerald Hutchins understood. All of the people who had looked at their plates understood. Watching through the window of May's at 8:47 in the morning, the small woman in the corner booth and the enormous gathering outside. And Nathan Hutchins's photograph capturing both at once. That's a reckoning. A community reckoning with what it had done by doing nothing. Finding the Saturday it had owed since Thursday. It's not comfortable. It shouldn't be comfortable. But it happened, and that matters, because the alternative to the uncomfortable reckoning is to let it be Thursday forever. And Thursday forever is a cost that communities pay in the accumulated weight of uncorrected things. Harlan Creek paid its Saturday. The photo is on the wall to remind it. Now I need to tell you something about the jacket itself, about what's on the back of it, because I mentioned the patches and the road pins and the bottom rocker, but I didn't tell you about the specific patch in the top center of the back panel, the one that sits above everything else, the one that Thomas had put there in 2019 after 37 years in the club. It's not a club patch. The club patches are on the front, on the chest, the way they go. The patch on the top center of the back is a small rectangular one, about 4 inches wide. It has no text. It's a design. 2 roads meeting at a horizon, going into distance, and above the horizon, 3 small stars. Just that. No explanation. Thomas had it made by a woman in Medford who did custom leather work, brought her the design on a piece of paper, said, "This is what I want."